Commencement by Joanna Parypinski. They say the Academy sits on a stretch of wasted desert scrub. There are no roads to the Academy, no sign markers, and it would seem the only way anyone has ever found it on their own is by mistake, while dehydrated and overheated and terribly lost on an ill-conceived hike, the structure appearing from nowhere as a wavering mirage, as the stories go. And those who tell the stories, a friend of a friend who stumbled there quite by accident, say they can never find it again. I take it you've never met someone with a first-hand acquaintance who has been to the Academy. Yes? It is always diluted, the brother-in-law of a friend who knows someone who went there. Perhaps this is because the Academy decides who is accepted, not by application, for no one applies, but by some esoteric method that yet remains a mystery to us. My sister received one such acceptance. Yes, she attended the Academy some years ago, prior to her disappearance. I will tell you what I know of it. As the stories go, the Academy was burnt by a devastating fire many years ago, which killed the majority of students and teachers inside. Prior to this fire, it was an ordinary school. It was constructed in an older style, with a belfry in the steeple and an old iron bell that clanged twice daily, once when the classes commenced and once when they ended for the day. The bricks, back then, had been a lustrous red, with many windows allowing natural sunlight into the few rooms therein. Students came from the surrounding desert communities to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic in the conventional style. The fire was the beginning of the Academy's mutation. How exactly did the fire begin? Alas, we may never know the cause. And would it change anything, after all, to know what precipitated the disaster? However it began, the fire soon raged through the school, burning out anything that lay within, desks, books, maps, and leaving behind only the scorched outer shell, desiccated and hollow. The fire burned so hot that the red bricks glowed ghost white and then blackened with soot. The windows exploded in the heat. The doors buckled in their frames. Children died, that much we all knew. How many is anyone's guess? By all rights, the Academy should have shut down entirely, for there was no funding to rebuild and no teachers left after the devastation. It should have become a ruin, a strange, bleak reminder of the whims of the desert. But the building, well, it refused to die. Without the appearance of a single construction worker, without a shred of blueprints for renovation, without the faintest echo of hammering, or, in truth, of any sound at all, the building began to change. As if an organic thing, a lizard that lost its tail, it regrew its hollowed classrooms and collapsed walls. Bricks stitched themselves over the broken windows like scabs over an open wound, until there were no longer any orifices to the outside, but for the doorways, which reclaimed their doors and sealed them shut. But even after it was healed, the academy continued trying to fix itself. New doorways carved themselves out of the brick and were overlaid by doors that opened onto nothing. Black pits, or brick walls, or simply what appeared to be a gaping emptiness. Staircases blossomed in unusual places, dead-ending into the ground. Rooms led to other rooms, led to other rooms, led back to the first room in a dizzying labyrinth. Classrooms gained bizarre dimensions with tilted ceilings and floors, so that at one end of the room you might appear as a giant, and at the other, a tiny doll. This was the exact effect I witnessed at my sister's graduation, of which I will tell you presently. The academy's physical structure was not the sole beneficiary of the changes that took place there. They, whoever they are, for the academy surely must have acquired new teachers at some point, although no one knows who they might be or where they come from, stopped teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. New subjects included the occult, physics with laws that defy those we all know and understand, abstruse mathematics dealing almost entirely in unreal numbers and functions that could not be solved by usual means, dividing by zero, square rooting negative numbers, and others even more unsolvable. Histories that never occurred, languages never spoken by human tongues. As the stories go, of course. I'm sure we would all like to know the intricacies of these curious subjects, but the problem is that no one ever comes out of the academy. Students either remain to become the teachers of the next generation of students, or they vanish entirely, never to be seen again. As the stories go, and the stories, my dear friend, are true. I was always jealous of my sister. This was something I have rarely shared aloud with another person. It seems strange to say it, at last, but it is true. I was jealous of her. She was not strictly beautiful, nor popular. Precocious, yes, but she was frequently ill, and her skin had a mottled appearance. But perhaps her most defining feature was her blind eye, a galaxy of milk-white haziness which had webbed the pupil since birth. And so she had always been an outcast, you see, leaving her plenty of time to read. Too much time, perhaps. No subject was off limits. One week it was ancient history, and the next science or philosophy. I wonder if I might have achieved her level of intelligence, of curiosity, if only I had been born with some deformity. I had everything she did not. I wouldn't go so far as to call myself beautiful, but neither am I strange or ugly. I had a decent cadre of companions when I was young, and I never lacked for activities and distractions. Yet, whereas I merely excelled in school, she surged ahead, burning through enrichment programs, skipping grades, until she was 14 and received her acceptance into the academy. Of course, my parents sent her because no one declined an acceptance into the academy. I do not recall the method of her transportation, and I couldn't ask my parents now, for my mother has long since passed, and my father is so far gone with dementia that he can scarcely recognize me. Once she was secreted away, I did not see my sister for 4 years, until her graduation. She wrote only days before the event, informing me that they had been allowed to invite a few select guests to the occasion, and those who had only been vetted by the Academy. Apparently, I passed their careful scrutiny. I was in college by that time, and halfway across the country from our old hometown, which was on the edge of that desert where the Academy sits. But I immediately bought a bus ticket that would take me home, and thence make my way to the ceremony. She provided me detailed directions in the letter, saying that few attendees make it to the right place because they get lost on their way. When we were children, we filled our star charts together, and she used this knowledge of astronomy to clarify the directions. In this way, I drove my rental car across the desert scrub in a cloud of dust, my tires grumbling and bumping on the uneven ground. The ceremony was to take place at midnight. I followed the stars across the desert for hours, passing a few distinctive changes in the landscape that my sister had mentioned in her letter. Finally, I came upon the last marker, a many-limbed cactus grown tumorous with knobs and bulges. I stopped to count the limbs, but the thin moonlight and cold shadows conspired to make their numbering impossible. In the center of this tangled mass of limbs was a round, protruding knob surrounded by a darker circle, like a watchful eye. I passed on, and just a few miles beyond this cactus, I found the Academy. There were no windows, so the whole building looked dark and abandoned. The moonlight revealed its scorched outer walls in ghostly hues. I left my vehicle and went in search of the front door. As I approached the derelict structure, which seemed to grow taller the nearer I drew, the iron bell upon the steeple tolled like a groan from a rusted throat. My watch confirmed the bell's claim of midnight. At the front of the building, where you might expect to see a large set of double doors inviting you inside, I found not a hint of ingress. The blackened brick stretched on unbroken, tall as a tower, like a haunted thing, a living thing that had regrown its own unliving flesh. But I was not to give up here. I had to see my sister. It had been too long. I missed her, and though part of me despised her, for she was superior, and I so unremarkable, I loved her as a sister does, as one who has shared a young lifetime's worth of memories. I must have circled the building 3 times, feeling my way along the endless, terrible brick, before I found a narrow door set into a dark recess. At once I opened it and stepped into a corridor lit only by a faint red light emitting from beneath the door at the opposite end of the hall. When I reached the other door, I found the knob hot to the touch and the door locked. I banged my fist upon it. The door itself was hot, with an indefinable smell emanating from it. When I stepped back, I noticed another door to my left, and I went inside. This led to another series of doors and rooms through which I stumbled, taking only the vaguest note of the desks and other minutiae ordinarily found at a school. Some rooms were utterly black, others pervaded with a red light suffusing from around the corners and cracks in the walls. Here I nearly stumbled straight into a globe, and in writing it I found a world that was somewhat, yet not quite, our own. By dull red light I observed the globe, but I found not a single name or country that I could recognize. The continents were misshapen, filled with mutated countries, places unknown on this planet. I let go of the globe and stepped away. Growing agitated, I hurried into the next room and saw again, by the faint red light, scrawls of text on a blackboard in a language I did not recognize. And on I went, from room to room. What strange and wondrous oddities I found therein. At last, a figure intercepted me in a doorway, a stiff, matronly shape that turned on a light and washed the room in a harsh, fluorescent light. I could not tell the pale woman's age. It could have been 30 or 70. There was a severe cast to her face, reminding me of every unhappy schoolmarm I'd ever come across. "You are late for the ceremony," she said. As I followed her, I stumbled over several apologies and explanations of how I had gotten lost, but she seemed uninterested. At last she pointed me through a set of double doors, where I entered a small auditorium, lost in darkness, but for the piercing lights that glared upon the stage, where another figure stood speaking. Only 2 seats in the auditorium were occupied by the shadowed silhouettes of other visitors. I found a seat in the back and slid into it, grateful that the introductory speech had not yet ended, so I had not missed much. When I had calmed enough to listen, for my nerves had been nearly undone by my trek through the desert and subsequent walk through the horrid academy, this is what I heard. That pursuit of knowledge, we understand, is the pinnacle of any education, rather than knowledge that can actually be acquired. The pursuit itself, if entered into correctly, can help us transcend into the next level of learning, unbounded by this world's severe physical limitations. Even the brain itself, as a physical organism, can only perceive so much, can only engage in the pursuit of knowledge as far as its comprehension will allow. And it is the ultimate goal, of course, to move beyond this basic level of learning. The simple confidence of the average human who believes he has acquired knowledge is the ultimate falsity. Only in the face of the abject, the great abyss, can this lie with which we are born, this original sin, be shed and the real pursuit begin. For to believe that one knows anything is the ultimate delusion, the ultimate evil of the ego. Yet only a few can withstand gazing into the infinite. Our students are selected carefully by an intense process of evaluation. Yet even some of these chosen few drive themselves mad in attempting our curriculum, because they are unable to lose themselves. So attached are they to this utter sham that is the ego, which is the barrier between us and the real pursuit into the limitless, the unconscious. Every few years We do have several students who have completed our curriculum and are ready to either become educators themselves or to begin the next chapter of their transformation. It is these students that we celebrate today for their impressive curiosity, their ability to understand, as none others do, that they know nothing, that they are nothing. I did not like the way the lights were aimed behind this figure at the podium, so that I was seeing only a shadow, and could make out none of the features of his face. His face? You know, I can scarcely say if it was male or female. The voice was a dead neutral, and the shape somehow formless. Before I could take the chance to squint and try to understand what I was seeing, the figure stepped aside and disappeared backstage. The first graduate appeared at one end of the stage, clad in black robes and looking impossibly large. I was already unnerved, and the sight of a young man so vast upon that small stage nearly undid me. Then he took a step, and another, across the stage, and began minutely to shrink. By the time he reached the middle of the stage, which suddenly seemed much larger than it had, he was down to the size of a normal human. I realized that this stage had been erected with those deceptive proportions that made one seem to change size depending upon where one stood, an optical illusion that is extremely disconcerting to the eye. As he walked across the stage, which seemed to lengthen interminably as he walked, he became smaller and smaller until he was about the size of a doll. Then, exactly that size, he walked off the end of the stage behind the curtain, into the backstage area where he was, I could only assume, in fact a normal size, as he had been all along. The illusion made me dizzy. In this manner, another student walked across the stage, only this one became even smaller than the first, perhaps only a few inches tall by the end, to my perception, though I continually reminded myself that it was merely an illusion. What was this curious geometry? I had the urge to discuss this effect with someone else in the audience, but the two other attendees were seated far ahead of me, unmoving. No one clapped when the graduates made their way across the stage. The third and final student to cross the stage was my sister. She stepped out, a full-grown woman now, these 4 years later, and splendid in the awful lights. Somehow her pale and mottled skin, even more pronounced now, was sublime. On seeing her, I felt love and awe and fear. She turned to look into the audience, and the lights caught her blind eye, stitched over with clouds and rolling in its socket. I stood up, waving, but it was so dark in the back of the auditorium that I don't believe she could see me, for her good eye never quite landed on me. She turned and began her walk, becoming smaller as she crossed the stage, and I sidled into the narrow center aisle of the auditorium, and down its length toward the stage, still waving, hoping she would turn and see me. She reached the center of the stage, and thus a normal size. I wanted her to stop, to remain that size, not to venture any further, where she would become so small that she might no longer seem human. I started walking more quickly, just as she began to shrink, and my heart pounded with dread watching her. I knew it was an illusion, but I could not bear to see her grow smaller and smaller. She was 3/4 of the way across the stage, and so small, so unnaturally small, when I shouted her name. She paused, and looked out with those tiny eyes, one pure gleaming white, like a crystal ball. I was almost to the stage now, and I raised my arms again, motioning for her to stop. She saw me, I am sure, for a smile broke out across her face. A smile and something more. Something in her eyes. I shook my head irrationally. I did not want her to finish crossing that stage. But she turned again and continued to the other end, shrinking to the size of an insect. Then smaller, smaller still, a speck of dust, an atom, and she disappeared altogether. I called her name again, but she had vanished, not behind a curtain, but into the air. The lights on the stage dimmed, and the other two audience members stood up and filed out of the auditorium. I leapt onto the stage, noting faintly that from up here it seemed to be composed of quite an ordinary geometry after all, with no unusual angles or illusions. I walked to the side where the two tiny students had gone, and where my sister had been approaching before she disappeared. There, I found an utter blackness that repelled me, but I felt my way inside, calling her name again, thinking she must come out. But no one was there. I stumbled through the dark for so long, and I thought I may never find my way out again. But finally, I was ejected into another hallway. I ran blindly through that academy, through impossible rooms, calling for my sister, to no avail. At last, I found myself again in that hallway I had originally entered, before that door with the red glow seeping out from underneath. This must be where they had gone. I banged my fist upon it, calling for someone to admit me, and the door swung open with a disused croak. It opened onto a staircase that led down, descending into the earth, and somewhere at the bottom was that red glow. The teachers must be down there, I was sure, and the new graduates. I took one step onto the groaning staircase, and another. Had there been a handrail, it wouldn't have helped a bit, for my palms were slicked with sweat. Rather than cooling, the air grew warmer the deeper I went, filled with the stink of something rancid burning. I seemed to be descending endlessly, and it occurred to me that the further I went, the red glow would be forever just out of reach. I could no longer make out the doorway through which I had entered. I stood alone on that impossible staircase. A kind of trance came over me as I walked in semi-darkness, guided by the red light, down that infinity of stairs, until at long last I beheld the end of it. But it was not any sort of basement. How can I describe it? What I saw there was a city of flames, and above me, where a ceiling might have been, I perceived unfamiliar stars. There were people there too, in that city, although I do not believe I can really call them people. Back up the stairs I fled, hardly aware of myself. I saw only glimpses, shadows, but this was enough for my brain to block out whatever those beings were. And so, I cannot describe to you what I saw, for it is buried somewhere in my deepest dreams. I returned to the desert a few days later to find it again in daylight. I made it as far as that strange cactus, but it was missing the knob that appeared to be an eye, so I cannot be sure that it was even the same one. When I continued several miles from there, I found no academy, just a barren wasteland of desert. I apologize that I cannot tell you more, but that is all I know. At least, now, you have another story of the Academy to add to your collection of rumors and intrigue, one more piece of a puzzle that will never be completed. For each time you gain a new piece of information, the puzzle expands infinitely as you realize how many more pieces might possibly exist, how many more things there are that you can never see and never know in this world. As for me, I never saw my sister again, for she had achieved the ultimate triumph at the age of 18, when she disappeared into the filaments of the air and graduated from this earthly form.